Empire of Blood, Episode 2, Civilizing the Natives. Leopold II, the Belgian Congo, 1885 to 1908, a production of Empire of Blood. The photograph exists. It was taken sometime around 1904 in the territory then known as the Congo Free State by a missionary named Alice Seeley Harris. It shows a man named Nzala sitting on a veranda. He is lean, bare-chested, and he is looking down at something on the wooden floor in front of him. At first, if you do not know what you are seeing, you might think he is simply resting, leaning forward, contemplating something in the dirt. But then your eyes find what is on the floor. A small hand, a small foot. They belonged to his daughter, Boali. She was 5 years old. The soldiers of the Force Publique came to his village of Wala while Nzala was away. They came because the village had not met its rubber quota for the week. The quota was the amount of wild rubber that every community in the Congo Free State was required to harvest and deliver to the nearest colonial post. The quota did not bend for illness, for bad weather, for the collapse of a vine, for the simple fact that the forest had been stripped and the rubber was running out. The quota was the quota. You met it or you did not. And if you did not, the soldiers came. On this particular visit, the soldiers killed Nzala's wife and daughter. Then they cut off Boali's hand and foot and left them on the veranda for Nzala to find when he returned. This was not a barren behavior. This was not a patrol that had gone rogue, not soldiers acting outside their orders. The severing of hands was policy. It was accounting. Soldiers in the Force Publique were issued a fixed number of bullets, and they were required to justify each bullet expended. The justification took a physical form. For every bullet fired, and a soldier was expected to produce a severed human hand as proof that the round had been used to kill a person rather than fired into the bush, wasted, or traded to local people. The hands were brought to colonial posts in baskets. They were counted. They were entered into records. And the records were sent up the chain of command to offices in Boma and ultimately to a palace in Brussels. Think about that chain. From the veranda where a father sits staring at what remains of his daughter, all the way to an oak-paneled office in Belgium, the information flowed. Not as horror, not as atrocity, as data, as tonnage, as evidence that the system was functioning as designed. Nzala's village had not met the quota. Soldiers were dispatched. A woman and a child were killed. Their hands were severed and counted. The quota was noted as still unmet. The soldiers moved on to the next village. No one in Brussels was alarmed. Alice Harris photographed Nzala because she understood, with the clarity of someone who has seen an atrocity that the world does not yet know about, that words would not be enough. She had already written letters. Other missionaries had already written letters. The letters were polite, documented, horrifying, and they had been ignored. What the world needed, she believed, was to look at a face, not a description of suffering, but the actual specific, irreducible face of a man sitting with what was left of his child. She was right. So the photograph became one of the primary instruments of the Congo reform movement that eventually, after years of international pressure, forced the Belgian government to wrest the territory from the man who owned it. The photograph was published in newspapers. It was shown at lantern-slide lectures across Britain and the United States. It was placed before members of Parliament and senators who had been able, until that moment, to hold the horror at a comfortable distance of abstraction. How you cannot hold Nzala's face at a comfortable distance. But here is what the photograph does not show. It does not show the palace in Brussels. It does not show the mahogany desk where the orders were written, the financial statements where rubber tonnage was converted into Belgian francs. the private correspondence in which the architect of this system expressed satisfaction with the system's results. It does not show the man who sat at the center of all of it, he who never visited the Congo in his entire life, who never saw a severed hand except perhaps as a line in an accounting ledger, who believed until his dying day that he had brought civilization to a continent and deserved not condemnation, but gratitude. His name is Leopold II. He is king of the Belgians. He is the sole proprietor, by international agreement, of a territory in Central Africa approximately 76 times the size of his own country. See, he has held this territory since 1885 and will hold it until 1908. In those 23 years, by the most careful modern estimates, between 8 and 10 million people will die as a result of the system he designed. Others put the figure higher. No one puts it lower. He never fired a gun. He never gave a direct order to cut off a child's hand. And he sat in a palace in Brussels and signed documents and read reports and approved budgets and watched the rubber money accumulate in his private accounts. And the hands piled up in baskets at the colonial posts, and the photographs were taken, and the world eventually looked. But by then, Nsala had already sat on that veranda for a very long time. Stay with me. We need to understand how a man builds something like this. We need to understand how a king in Europe, 3,000 miles from a Congolese village, architects a system so efficient that mutilation becomes an administrative category. We need to go back to the beginning, to a small, nervous country in northwestern Europe that desperately wanted to matter, and to the prince who grew up watching it fail. There is a cruelty in the photograph that goes beyond what is depicted. There is a cruelty in the fact that it was necessary at all. That the evidence of what was happening in the Congo Free State had to be made visually undeniable before the world would pay attention, before the reports of missionaries and the testimonies of survivors were taken seriously enough to generate political action. The words had existed for years. The accounts were detailed and specific and corroborated, and they were not enough. It took a face on a veranda, staring at a small hand and a small foot, to make the abstraction concrete enough to move people who had every incentive not to be moved. Nsala did not speak English. He did not know that his photograph would be shown to members of the British Parliament, to audiences in churches in Liverpool and Boston, to newspaper readers across Europe and North America. He did not know that his face would become, for the reformers who used it, a symbol of everything the Congo reform movement was arguing. He sat on that veranda because that is where he was when Alice Harris arrived. He sat because there was nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, no response adequate to what lay on the floor in front of him. He is looking at it. That is all. He is simply looking at it. There is something in that stillness that refuses to resolve into any of the categories we might want to put it in. Defiance, grief, shock, incomprehension. It is all of those and none of them. See, it is a man confronting a fact that his world did not contain a framework for. The system that produced this fact existed on another continent, in a palace, in the head of a man who had never been here, who had never come here, who knew the territory he owned primarily through tonnage figures in quarterly reports. The distance between that palace and that veranda is the central subject of this episode. It is a distance of geography, obviously, of culture and language and power. But it is also a distance that was deliberately maintained and deliberately managed, because the palace required the distance. The system could not function if the man at the top of it had to look at what it produced. The system required, as one of its structural features, that the man who designed it never see a face like Nsala's. This is why Leopold II never went to the Congo. Not because travel was impossible. Other Europeans made the journey routinely. Not because the situation was too dangerous. He had an army there, such as it was. He did not go because going would have required him to encounter the material reality of what his orders produced, and encountering that reality would have created a problem. Not necessarily a moral crisis, given what we know of Leopold's character, but a problem of cognition, of the management of information, and of maintaining the internal narrative in which he was a humanitarian king bringing progress to a benighted territory. The distance was not weakness, it was architecture, and it worked for a very long time. It worked long enough for the system to run for 2 decades, long enough for between 8 and 10 million people to die, long enough for Leopold to build his museums and his parks and his monuments in Belgium, to become in the eyes of many contemporaries exactly what he had always wanted to be seen as, a king who left something behind. He left something behind. To understand Leopold, you first have to understand the world he was born into. And the world he was born into was a world in which certain things were simply assumed to be true with the unquestioned certainty of gravity. The first assumption, Europe was civilization. Not a civilization. So not one of many possible forms of organized human society, but civilization itself, the apex of human development, the form toward which all other societies were either progressing or failing to progress. This was not a fringe view held by extremists. This was the operating premise of European intellectual, political, and religious life in the mid-19th century, held by conservatives and liberals alike, by devout Christians and secular progressives, by monarchists and republicans. The specifics of the argument varied. The conclusion was always the same. Europe had arrived. Everywhere else was still on the way. The second assumption, flowing directly from the first, European expansion into the rest of the world was not merely permissible, but morally necessary. If you are civilization, and the people across the sea are not yet civilization, then going to them with your railways and your Christianity and your legal systems and your administrative capacity is not conquest. It is a gift. It is the generous extension of what you have to people who have not yet achieved it. This is what historians call the civilizing mission, and it was not a cynical slogan invented by industrialists to disguise profit-taking. Many, perhaps most, of the people who invoked it believed it completely. The missionaries believed it. The colonial administrators believed it. The politicians who voted for overseas adventures believed it. The journalists who celebrated imperial expansion believed it. The belief was real. The third assumption was newer and more nakedly economic, but dressed, when presented in public, in the language of the first two. Colonies were productive. They generated wealth. They provided raw materials that European industry required at volumes that European soil could not supply. They provided markets for European manufactured goods. They provided land for European settlers who could not find economic futures at home. Colonies in this framework were not simply acceptable. They were necessary components of a functioning modern nation-state, the way ports were necessary, the way standing armies were necessary, the way a central bank was necessary. By the 1870s and 1880s, the major European powers had been accumulating colonial territories for 2 centuries, and Britain had India and chunks of Africa and Australia and Canada and the Caribbean. France had North Africa and West Africa and pieces of Southeast Asia. Portugal had Angola and Mozambique, remnants of a much older empire. The Netherlands, Spain, and Germany had their own holdings. Russia was expanding into Central Asia. Even tiny, newly unified Italy was looking hungrily at the North African coast. And then there was Belgium. Belgium in 1865, when Leopold II inherits the throne from his father. It is 35 years old as a nation. It was created in 1830, carved out of the Netherlands in a revolution that the great powers of Europe reluctantly recognized, because allowing Belgium to exist was less disruptive than the alternative. It is a small country, densely populated in the early throes of industrialization, that will eventually make it one of the wealthiest nations in Europe per capita. It has coal. It has iron. Thus it has textile mills and engineering works and the beginnings of a modern railway network. What it does not have, what it has never had, is colonies. This is not, by the late 19th century, a minor omission. To be a serious power in Europe is increasingly understood to mean having an overseas empire. Britain's global dominance is inseparable from its colonial holdings. France's status as a great power is partly measured by its territories. Germany, newly unified under Bismarck, is beginning to acquire African colonies with the specific rationale that a great power must have them. To not have colonies is to advertise a kind of second-tier status, to announce that you are a regional actor rather than a global one. And Belgian politicians, surveying this landscape, mostly shrug. Belgium is small. Belgium is neutral. Belgium's parliament is conservative and budget-conscious and not especially interested in overseas adventures that would cost money. It require military commitments and produce uncertain returns. Leopold does not shrug. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about what Leopold decides to do, we need to spend a few minutes with the specific machinery of European imperialism that he will eventually exploit, because this machinery is not something he invents. It exists before him. It has its own logic, its own incentive structures, its own self-justifying ideology. Leopold does not create the system of European colonialism. What he does is take the system and run it in a mode that even other imperialists find, eventually, too extreme to publicly defend. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 is perhaps the single most consequential diplomatic gathering in African history that was held entirely without any African participation. By the early 1880s, the scramble for Africa had accelerated to a pace that was creating dangerous competition between European powers. Britain and France were squabbling over territories in West and East Africa. Germany, newly unified and assertive, was staking claims in various directions. Portugal was asserting ancient rights over territories it had barely controlled for centuries. The whole situation was becoming diplomatically volatile, with the genuine possibility that competition for African territory could escalate into conflict between European nations. Bismarck called a conference. 14 nations sent representatives to Berlin. They sat around a table and discussed Africa for 3 months. They drew lines on maps. They agreed on rules for how future territorial claims would be recognized. They established the principle of effective occupation, that a claim to territory required actual administrative presence, and not just a flag on a beach and a treaty with a local chief. They divided a continent among themselves with a thoroughness and a speed that is extraordinary, even by the standards of 19th century imperial confidence. The people who lived on the continent being divided were not present. They were not consulted. They were the object of the conference, not its subjects. Their existing political structures, their kingdoms and chieftaincies and trade networks and cultural boundaries, were invisible to the men in Berlin. The lines they drew cut through ethnic territories, separated communities from their agricultural land, lumped together peoples with centuries of conflict into single administrative units, and divided peoples with centuries of common life into different colonial jurisdictions. The consequences of these lines are still being lived in Africa today. Leopold attended the Berlin Conference with an agenda, a strategy, and a story. And the agenda was to secure international recognition of his personal claim to the Congo Basin. The strategy was to present this claim not as personal aggrandizement, but as humanitarian service. And the story was the one he had been cultivating for almost a decade. That he was a philanthropist, not a monarch. A protector of African welfare, not a colonial predator. To the man who would bring civilization to Central Africa while simultaneously suppressing the Arab slave trade that was devastating the region. The story worked. The major powers at Berlin recognized the Congo Free State as a sovereign entity under Leopold's personal authority, not as a Belgian colony. Leopold was careful about this, because a Belgian colony would be subject to Belgian parliamentary oversight, and that was the last thing he wanted, as his personal property, and as a private enterprise governed by an individual rather than by a state. The Congo Free State was, in the legal language of 1885, a constitutional monarchy in which Leopold was both sovereign and sole proprietor. He had his empire. Now, we need to understand something about the economic context that will transform this empire from a development project, however hypocritical, into a killing machine. Because the system of terror that emerges in the Congo in the 1890s is not simply the expression of Leopold's personal sadism. It is the expression of Leopold's personal sadism interacting with a specific technological and economic development that transformed the value of what the Congo contained. The rubber boom. In 1888, a Scottish veterinarian named John Boyd Dunlop patents the pneumatic tire. He is trying to make his son's tricycle more comfortable to ride. What he actually does is ignite a global industrial transformation. Within a few years, pneumatic tires are being fitted to bicycles and then to the earliest automobiles, and the demand for rubber, vulcanized, elastic, durable rubber, begins to escalate at a rate that shocks the markets. Rubber plantations in Asia are years away from reaching full production. The only immediately available source of industrial-scale rubber is wild rubber, the latex that can be extracted from rubber vines growing in the forests of the Amazon and, crucially, the Congo Basin. The Congo Basin turns out to contain some of the most rubber-rich forests in the world. Leopold is sitting on a gold mine, but the gold mine requires labor to extract. Enormous amounts of labor. The rubber vines grow deep in dense forest, often miles from the nearest river or road. Reaching them, tapping them, carrying the latex back to collection points. This is brutal, exhausting work that takes days and leaves the workers with wounds from the caustic latex that adheres to their skin and hair. And it is work that the Congolese people, quite reasonably, do not want to do. Not under these conditions, not for these wages, not in this quantity. Leopold's response to this labor problem is the defining decision of his empire. He could have tried to create economic incentives, wages substantial enough to attract voluntary workers. He could have tried to develop other sectors of the Congolese economy alongside rubber extraction. He could have accepted lower profits in exchange for a more sustainable system. He does none of these things. He chooses terror. He chooses a system in which rubber quotas are enforced by armed men, whose authority includes the power to kill, to take hostages, to burn villages, and to mutilate those who resist or fail to produce. He chooses a system in which the violence is not incidental to the extraction, but constitutive of it, not the breakdown of an otherwise functional operation, but the engine that drives the operation forward. He chooses, in short, to build a machine. And to understand that machine, we need to understand the man who built it. The specific economic logic of European colonialism in the late 19th century requires more attention than it typically receives, because it explains something crucial about why the Congo became what it became, rather than something marginally better. The dominant ideology of European imperialism was not simply greed, though greed was certainly present. It was a specific theory of development, the idea that non-European territories contained resources that could not be productively used without European capital, European technical knowledge, and European administrative organization, and that the appropriate form of compensation for these European inputs was the extraction of profits that flowed back to Europe. Yes, this theory contained within it a set of implicit assumptions about African people that were not just factually wrong, but structurally necessary to the enterprise. If you believe that the resources of a territory are being wasted by its current inhabitants, that rubber is rotting in forests, that mineral deposits lie unworked, and that agricultural potential is unrealized, then you have constructed a justification for intervention that does not require you to think too hard about what the current inhabitants might want, because what they want is clearly subordinate to what the territory requires. The territory requires development. Development requires European management. The inhabitants are variables in a development equation rather than the primary subjects of the enterprise. Leopold did not invent this ideology, and he absorbed it, shared it, and deployed it with unusual self-awareness and effectiveness. His public statements about the Congo are worth reading carefully because they demonstrate a capacity to hold the civilizing mission narrative completely intact, while simultaneously designing the system that the narrative was constructed to disguise. In his public speeches, Leopold consistently described his project in terms of roads and schools and churches and the suppression of the slave trade. In his private correspondence, he was considerably more direct about the centrality of profit and the need to enforce labor through coercion. The gap between the public and private Leopold is not the gap between a man's sincere beliefs and his cynical performance. It is the gap between two different registers of the same belief system. Leopold genuinely believed, or had constructed a version of belief, that the extraction system he built was compatible with the civilizing mission he claimed. This is not as paradoxical as it sounds if you accept the premises of the system. If the Congolese people are not yet capable of organizing their own development, then imposing development upon them, even forcibly, even violently, is still development. It is still progress. It may look brutal from one angle. From another angle, it is the necessary medicine. Harsh, perhaps. Administered without consent, certainly. But the outcome: rubber extracted, revenue generated, infrastructure built, Belgium enriched. These things are real, and they constitute, in the framework Leopold inhabited, a genuine contribution to human progress. This is the moral universe of the man who designed the hand-cutting system. It does not excuse it, but it explains how a person of evident intelligence and genuine aesthetic sensibility and real political skill could authorize what the force publique did in the Congo basin and sleep soundly afterward in his palace. The scramble for Africa, and of which Leopold's acquisition of the Congo was a part, accelerated dramatically in the 1880s and 1890s, and the acceleration had consequences that the Berlin Conference had not fully anticipated. By creating a framework for recognizing territorial claims based on effective occupation, the conference incentivized rapid occupation. The physical presence of administrative posts, the signing of treaties, the establishment of supply lines, to the creation of whatever minimal infrastructure would satisfy the effective occupation standard. This incentive structure drove European powers to claim territories faster than they could be meaningfully administered, which meant that in many cases, the administration that existed was primarily military, primarily focused on maintaining control and extracting revenue, with no real capacity, or in some cases, no real intention of providing the services that the civilizing mission narrative promised. The Congo Free State is an extreme case of this pattern, but it is not an isolated aberration. The rubber regime in the French Congo, immediately to the north of Leopold's territory, operated on similar principles. The concession system, the forced labor, the violence, all of these features appeared in French-controlled territories as well, though perhaps with slightly less systematic efficiency and certainly with less detailed documentation. Now, the German territories in Africa saw violent uprisings met with deliberate genocidal campaigns. The Herero and Nama genocide in what is now Namibia, carried out between 1904 and 1908, killed between 50 and 100,000 people and constitutes the first genocide of the 20th century, by most scholarly definitions. The British in Kenya, and the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, colonial rule across the continent produced suffering at scales that the civilizing mission narrative was never equipped to acknowledge or account for. Leopold's Congo is the case study that breaks through into historical consciousness with particular clarity for several reasons. The meticulous documentation by missionaries and activists, the role of photography, and the specific horror of the hand-cutting system as a symbol that is both concrete and undeniable, and the fortunate circumstance that reformers like Morel and Casement were gifted communicators who understood how to make their case to a mass audience. But it sits within a broader pattern of imperial violence that the case study format sometimes obscures. The world that made Leopold possible was a world that had made many Leopolds possible. His particular genius was for scale, so for administrative efficiency, for the management of distance and the maintenance of a public persona through decades of evidence to the contrary. But the underlying logic that European profit justified African suffering, that the inhabitants of colonized territories were instruments rather than subjects, that civilization was something you brought rather than something you found. This logic was broadly shared across the imperial world, and it produced horrors across the entire colonial map. When we focus on Leopold, as this episode does, we should hold simultaneously in view the fact that he represents a specific and extreme version of something that was everywhere around him. He was the architect, but he was not the only builder. And the building, as we will see when we turn to the man himself, did not begin in the Congo. It began in a small country in northwestern Europe where a prince grew up watching the world's great empires expand and decided, with a determination that contemporaries found unsettling even before they knew what it would produce, that he would have one too. Leopold Louis-Philippe Marie Victor was born on April 9th, 1835, in the Royal Palace of Brussels, the second child and eldest son of Leopold I and his second wife, Louise Marie of Orléans. He was a prince from his first breath, insulated from ordinary life by every layer of privilege that mid-19th century European royalty could provide. And yet, from a remarkably early age, he seems to have understood that his circumstances were, by the standards he was already developing, insufficient. This is not as paradoxical as it sounds. Leopold grew up in a country that was still deciding what it was. Belgium in the 1830s and 1840s was a new nation with an identity crisis, a constitutional monarchy created by revolution and recognized by European powers who were not entirely sure it would survive. His father, Leopold I, was a German prince who had been imported to sit on the Belgian throne and who spent his reign working to establish both the stability of the country and the dignity of the royal house. He was a competent, careful, somewhat colorless monarch, exactly what the situation required, and exactly what the son found insufficient. Because what Leopold I lacked, in the eyes of his son, was an empire. This sounds like an adolescent ambition, and it was at first. But Leopold II carried it into adulthood with an intensity that contemporaries found remarkable and sometimes unsettling. He studied colonial economics obsessively from his teenage years. He read reports on the Dutch East Indies, on British India, on the Portuguese territories in Africa and Asia. He traveled when he could, to Egypt, to Spain, to the Near East. And everywhere he went, he was looking at the same thing. How do empires function? How do they generate wealth? How does a country with colonies compare economically to a country without them? He was not a stupid man. This point needs to be made clearly because it is tempting, when confronting someone who built what Leopold built, to explain the horror through some fundamental mental deficiency, some inability to understand or to feel. Leopold was not deficient in understanding. He was, in many respects, one of the most strategically gifted monarchs of his era. Patient, detail-oriented, capable of maintaining a long-term strategic vision over decades, skilled at the kind of public image management that was becoming increasingly important in the age of mass media. His intelligence is not in question. What is in question, and what we need to examine carefully, is what his intelligence was in service of. He was, at his core, a man of accounts. He thought in terms of inputs and outputs, of investments and returns, of assets and liabilities. This is not unusual in a monarch of the industrial age, but in Leopold it was more consuming, more total, more the primary lens through which he processed the world than is typical even among the most economically minded rulers. His correspondence is full of financial calculations. His diaries contain detailed analyses of colonial revenue streams, his architectural projects. And he was a passionate builder, and he remade Brussels in his image at enormous expense, were partly about genuine aesthetic vision and partly about demonstrating, to himself and others, what the returns on imperial investment could purchase. He treated people the way he treated capital. They were assets, deployed in the service of larger strategic goals. His wife, Marie-Henriette, was a dynastic acquisition who he largely ignored after producing the necessary heirs. His daughters were instruments of diplomatic marriage-making, and his son, the Crown Prince Rudolf, died young and childless, a dynastic catastrophe, and Leopold's response was characterized more by anxiety about succession logistics than by grief. His relationships with his children were formal, cold, and transactional. He was not a man who loved easily or expressed warmth naturally. He was a man who assessed, calculated, and decided. His relationship with Africa begins well before the Berlin Conference, before Henry Morton Stanley, before the Congo Free State. It begins in the 1860s, when Leopold is in his late 20s and early 30s and has not yet inherited the throne, and it is characterized by a quality of attention that, in retrospect, looks like hunger. He writes a letter in 1861 that is often quoted by historians as a kind of encapsulation of his thinking. In it, he describes his desire to acquire a territory that would be useful and would allow him to demonstrate what a small country could achieve in the wider world. The language is careful, forward-looking, explicitly about legacy and demonstration. He wants to show something. He wants to prove something. And what he wants to prove is that Belgium, that he, can play in the same league as the great empires. The ambition is not inherently sinister. Thus many men in the 19th century wanted to build empires, and many of them believed genuinely that they were improving the territories they acquired. What makes Leopold's ambition peculiarly dangerous is the combination of several specific traits that, taken together, create the conditions for the Congo Free State. The first trait is the complete detachment of means from ends. Leopold wanted to build an empire, wanted the wealth and the prestige and the legacy it would bring, and he was willing to use whatever methods the situation required without allowing the methods to trouble his understanding of what he was doing. The violence in the Congo was, from his perspective, simply the enforcement mechanism necessary to make the extraction system function. That this enforcement mechanism involved the systematic mutilation and killing of millions of people was a fact he was aware of. He received reports, he read summaries, but it did not modify his self-image because it was, in his mental architecture, categorized elsewhere. It was operational, it was the machinery rather than the mission. The mission remained civilizing, humanitarian, progressive. This is a form of compartmentalization that is worth spending time on because it recurs across history in the people who build systems of atrocity. It is rarely the case that such people are indifferent to all human suffering. They are often capable of genuine kindness and genuine grief within their immediate social world. What they have done is construct a perimeter around that social world, and outside the perimeter, the ordinary rules of human feeling do not apply. Leopold could be sentimental about Belgium, about his buildings, about his vision of European civilization. The Congolese people were outside the perimeter. Their suffering registered, when it registered at all, so as a logistical problem rather than a moral one. The second trait is the extraordinary patience with which Leopold pursued his colonial ambitions. He did not arrive at the Congo Free State quickly. He spent approximately 20 years building toward it, identifying opportunities and cultivating relationships, and constructing the international persona that would make the thing possible. This patience is genuinely impressive by any measure. And he tried and failed to acquire territories in multiple locations: Sarawak, the Philippines, the Transvaal, Mozambique, Fiji, even parts of Latin America, before focusing on Central Africa. Each failure was absorbed and analyzed. Each rejection became information. He adjusted his tactics, refined his pitch, and moved on. The genius of his eventual strategy, the humanitarian mask, deserves particular attention because it was not simply cynical. It was strategically brilliant in the specific context of late 19th century European politics. By the 1870s, the abolitionist movement that had ended the Atlantic slave trade was one of the most powerful moral forces in European public life. Missionaries and explorers returning from Africa brought with them harrowing accounts of the ongoing Arab slave trade in East and Central Africa, a trade that was genuinely catastrophic for the regions it touched. European publics, primed by decades of abolitionist sentiment, were emotionally available for a narrative in which a European power intervened in Africa to suppress this trade. Leopold saw this availability and built his entire public campaign around it. He created organizations: the International African Association, the International Association of the Congo, that had the appearance of multinational philanthropic bodies and were, in reality, instruments of his personal ambition. He funded expeditions to Central Africa, framed as scientific and humanitarian missions. He cultivated relationships with explorers, missionaries, and journalists who could be useful in building the narrative. He gave speeches, wrote letters, hosted conferences. He constructed, brick by careful brick, an international identity as the enlightened monarch who wanted only to bring civilization and freedom to the people of Central Africa. And the world believed him. This is the part that is genuinely hard to understand from our contemporary vantage point, but it is essential to absorb. The world believed Leopold II for a remarkably long time. The Berlin Conference recognized his claims, The United States was among the first to do so. Newspapers across Europe described the Congo Free State in terms that would have pleased Leopold enormously. The humanitarian establishment of the era, the people who were, by the standards of their time, the moral conscience of European public life, endorsed his project. Some of them even worked for it. The man most important to Leopold's actual acquisition of the Congo is Henry Morton Stanley, the Welsh-American explorer who had become famous for finding Dr. David Livingstone in East Africa in 1871. Stanley is a fascinating figure in his own right, a man of violent, complicated character who had himself experienced profound displacement and deprivation in his early life. An orphan who had reinvented himself through sheer force of will and remarkable physical endurance. He was brutal with his porters and ruthless in his travel through African territories, and he was also a journalist and a showman of the first order who understood how to package exploration for European audiences hungry for adventure. Leopold hired Stanley in 1878, after Stanley had completed a pioneering traverse of the Congo River basin, to return to the Congo and establish a series of stations along the river. These stations were presented publicly as trading posts and scientific outposts. Their actual purpose was to create the physical infrastructure of Leopold's planned state. The buildings, the supply lines, the negotiated relationships with local leaders. That would make his claim of effective occupation credible when the Berlin Conference convened. Stanley negotiated treaties with hundreds of local chiefs in the Congo Basin between 1879 and 1884. These treaties transferred sovereignty over vast territories to the entity that would become the Congo Free State. They were, in many cases, signed by chiefs who had no understanding that they were transferring sovereignty, who believed they were agreeing to terms of trade or establishing friendly relations or simply responding to the ritual demands of a well-armed visitor. And some of the treaties were signed with an X by men who could not write. Some were witnessed by Stanley's employees. Some were extracted under conditions that made refusal dangerous. This is the legal foundation of the Congo Free State. Treaties that the people who signed them largely did not understand, acquired by an explorer working for a king who had no legitimate connection to the territory, ratified by European powers who were interested primarily in managing their own competition for African resources. Leopold becomes the sole sovereign of an area approximately the size of Western Europe. He now has the territory. What he needs is revenue. And what he has in the late 1880s is a colony that is costing him far more than it is returning. Expeditions, administration, military forces, the construction of roads and railways that are necessary to make extraction feasible. He is borrowing from Belgian banks, leveraging his personal fortune, managing the finances with a skill that would impress even his critics, but that is, ultimately, producing a deficit rather than the surplus he needs. And then the rubber boom begins. This is the moment where the system tips, where the humanitarian facade cracks, not all at once, but progressively, under the pressure of the realization that the Congo contains something enormously valuable, and that extracting it at the scale Leopold needs requires a kind of coercion that the civilizing mission narrative cannot fully absorb. He makes a series of decisions in the early 1890s that set the template. He decrees that all vacant land in the Congo Free State, which in practice means all land not visibly occupied by a village at the moment of declaration, belongs to the state. Since the Congolese people practiced seasonal migration, since many communities used land that was not continuously occupied, since the definition of vacant was essentially whatever Leopold's administrators decided it was, this effectively strips the Congolese people of rights over most of their territory and all of its resources. The rubber vines growing in the forest are now state property, and the Congolese people are not permitted to harvest them for their own benefit or to trade the latex freely. They can only deliver it to the state at the prices the state sets. Then he levers the concession system. Large areas of the Congo are parceled out to private companies in which Leopold holds substantial shares, that are granted exclusive rights to extract resources from their territories. These companies have their own armed forces, their own administrative structures, like their own systems for managing the population within their concession areas. They are accountable primarily to their own profit margins and secondarily to the overall administration of the Congo Free State. They are not accountable in any meaningful way to the people who live in their territories. Then he sets the quotas. Each village is assigned a specific amount of rubber to deliver within a specific time. The quota is not negotiated. It is not calibrated to what the local forest can actually produce. It is set at the level required to generate the revenue the system demands, and it is enforced. The enforcement is the force publique, the man we see in the account books, in the diplomatic correspondence, in the private memos. The man who designed these decisions, who adjusted them based on revenue reports, who defended them against missionary criticism and carefully worded responses that acknowledged minor excesses while affirming the fundamental legitimacy of the system. That man is Leopold II, sitting in his palace in Brussels. He never went to the Congo. In 23 years of sovereign rule over a territory containing millions of people, Leopold II of Belgium never once visited the territory he owned. He governed through reports, through intermediaries, through a chain of command that stretched from his private secretary in Brussels, through the Governor-General in Boma, through the district commissioners to the armed patrols in the forest. He was separated from what his system was doing by 3,000 miles of ocean, by several layers of administrative language, and by his own absolute determination not to know, in the specific sensory way that would make denial impossible, what was being done in his name. This distance is not incidental, and it is structural. It is part of how the machine was built. Leopold was not the last man to design a system of mass violence from an administrative remove, but he was one of the first to do it at such scale, with such modern efficiency, in an era when the communications technology and the record-keeping systems existed to document the violence in unprecedented detail. The photographs, the missionary reports, to the survivor testimonies, all of this accumulated in a way that earlier atrocities had not. Because Leopold's Congo existed in the age of journalism and photography and transatlantic cables and the beginnings of international civil society. He could not maintain the distance forever, but he maintained it for an extraordinarily long time. And during that time, the machine ran. And the question of what makes a person capable of this, what specific combination of biography and temperament and ideology produces a man who can design a system like the Congo Free State, is not a question with a clean answer. Clean answers are available, and they are tempting precisely because they resolve the discomfort. The clean answer is, he was a monster. He was broken from the start. Something was wrong with him from the beginning that put him outside the range of normal human experience. The clean answer lets the rest of us off the hook. If Leopold was a monster, then the horror of the Congo is the product of exceptional wickedness, and exceptional wickedness is, by definition, rare. The probability of it happening again is low. The uncomfortable answer, the historically accurate answer, is more disturbing. Leopold was a recognizable type, not a common one, but not a freak of nature. He was an ambitious man with unusual intelligence and unusual patience, shaped by a specific cultural environment that told him that empire was a legitimate and admirable goal, that African people were a legitimate resource, that the business of a monarch was the aggrandizement of his country and his legacy. He was a product of his time in ways that don't excuse him, but do explain him, and the elements of his character that produced the Congo, the compartmentalization, the detachment of means from ends, the extraordinary tolerance for the suffering of people outside his immediate social world. These are not rare human qualities. They are human qualities that most people contain in embryo, and that specific circumstances can develop to monstrous scale. This is the uncomfortable answer. And it is the answer that the history of the Congo demands. Through his marriage to Marie Henriette of Austria in 1853, when Leopold was 18 and his bride 16, was a dynastic arrangement that neither party had chosen and neither party found satisfying. Marie Henriette was a vigorous, outdoor-loving woman who rode horses brilliantly and had no interest in politics or finance. Leopold had no interest in horses or outdoor life and was entirely absorbed in politics and finance. They were temperamentally incompatible in almost every respect, and the marriage settled quickly into a formal coexistence rather than a genuine partnership. They produced 4 children: Louise, Leopold, who died in infancy, Stephanie, and Clementine. And then, in 1869, their only surviving son, Leopold, died at the age of 9 from pneumonia. The death of the Crown Prince was a dynastic catastrophe and possibly something more personal. Leopold's response to his son's death is not well documented in terms of private grief. He was not a man who expressed private grief in ways that left record. What is documented is the aftermath. A marriage that became even more remote, a wife who increasingly withdrew from court life, and a Leopold who became, in the years following, even more focused on the project of the Congo with an intensity that some contemporaries read as compensation, and as the building of a different kind of legacy now that the biological one had become precarious. He had 3 daughters and no surviving son. He manipulated their marriages with the cold calculation that characterized all his personal relationships, using them as diplomatic instruments. His daughter Stephanie was married to Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary in a match that was socially brilliant and personally catastrophic. Rudolph was unstable, the marriage deeply unhappy. But in 1889, Rudolph and his mistress were found dead at the hunting lodge of Meierling in what was ruled a double suicide. Leopold's response to the death of his son-in-law and to his daughter's widowhood was primarily administrative. What would happen to the diplomatic value of the connection now that Rudolph was dead? This is Leopold. This is the man in the palace, reading the rubber tonnage reports with the same attention he brought to everything that fell within his framework of concern. His relationship with his country, Belgium, was more genuine and more complicated. He loved Belgium in the specific way that narcissists love their own reflection. He saw Belgium as an extension and expression of himself, and its glory was his glory, and its limitations were his frustrations. He built in Belgium with a passion that was genuinely aesthetic as well as vain. He commissioned monuments, parks, public buildings, thermal baths, the magnificent greenhouses at Laeken with their extraordinary iron and glass domes. He imagined Brussels as a capital worthy of an empire. He wanted Belgium to look from the outside like the great power he believed it could be with his guidance. And he funded all of this with Congo rubber, the Arcade du Cinquantenaire in Brussels, a grand, triumphal arch commissioned to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Belgian independence. Congo rubber, the Royal Museum of Central Africa at Tervuren. They're built to house the artifacts and natural history specimens that expeditions to the Congo brought back. Congo rubber, the public parks at Ostend, where Belgian families walked on summer evenings. Congo rubber. The palm house at Laeken, its glass roof housing tropical plants from across the empire. Congo rubber. Leopold walked through his museums and his parks and looked at what his money had built, and in the distance of 3,000 miles between Brussels and the Bolima veranda, operated as a kind of moral buffer. The buildings were real, the parks were beautiful, the rubber money was numbers in an account, converted into marble and iron and glass. The ensalas of the Congo basin were not present in the viewing of these monuments. They had been processed out of the visual field. What remained was civilization, the thing Leopold had always said he was building, rendered in stone and ironwork and exotic plants in a glass house. He was not stupid. He knew at some level that the accounts he received from the Congo contained evidence of something he would rather not fully process. The reports from the Commission of Inquiry, the complaints from the missionaries, the questions from foreign diplomats. These were not invisible to him. He managed them. He hired writers to produce counter-narratives. He funded newspapers to create alternative frames. As he commissioned his own investigations, designed to produce exculpatory findings. He fought the reformers with every tool available to him, and he was good at it, and he held them off for years. But the thing about photographs is that they do not require literacy. The thing about photographs is that they cross language barriers and cultural barriers, and the distance between a palace in Brussels and a lantern slide lecture in Liverpool. The thing about the photograph of Insala is that you cannot read it as civilization. You cannot see it as progress. It refuses, with the absolute muteness of a face confronting a fact, to be processed into any framework that makes it acceptable. Leopold never saw it. Or if he did not record his response. He died still believing, or professing to believe, that history would vindicate him. He wrote in his final years about the great work he had done, the civilization he had advanced, the legacy he was leaving. The burning of the archives was his last act of self-protection, but it was also, perhaps, the final expression of a belief that had sustained him through decades, that what the records showed was not the real story, that the real story was the buildings and the rubber, and the international recognition and the flag of the Congo Free State flying over a territory that had been, before him, outside the reach of civilization. He was wrong about the records. And the photographs survived. The missionary testimonies survived. The Casement report survived. The testimonies of survivors gathered by anthropologists and historians in the decades after the rubber regime ended survived. The oral histories of communities in the Congo basin, passed down through generations, survived. History did not vindicate Leopold II. It remembered him, and the remembering is its own verdict. We have spent 40 minutes with this man. Let us now look at the machine he built. The machine does not require his presence to understand it. It was designed precisely to function without his presence. That was the point. But we need to understand how it worked, who operated it, and what it looked like from inside the forest where the soldiers moved with their baskets. Let us begin with a specific place at a specific moment, because the machine is easier to understand when you can see its individual parts moving. And the village of Bolima is in the Equateur region of the Congo Basin, sometime in the mid-1890s. It sits near the edge of a stretch of forest that the concession company assigned to this territory has identified as rubber producing. The village has perhaps 150 people. Farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, a community with its own history and its own structures of authority and its own sense of how the world works. A few years ago, before the concession system was imposed, The people of Bolima traded rubber occasionally, when it was convenient, at prices they considered fair. That era is over. The company has assigned Bolima a weekly quota of rubber. The quota is expressed in kilograms. It requires the village's men to spend most of each week in the forest, walking hours to reach the rubber vines, tapping them, collecting the latex, carrying it back. It means the agricultural fields go partially untended. It means the fish traps are checked less often. And it means the community's food production is falling at the same time its labor demands are rising. The quota was set without any consultation with Bolima's chief. It was delivered as a fact, an obligation, with the information that failure to meet it would have consequences. The consequences are enforced by the sentinels. Sentinels are the local enforcement agents of the force publique, usually drawn from communities at some distance from the areas they patrol. This was deliberate policy, making it less likely that personal connections would soften enforcement. They are armed. They have authority to take hostages, to flog, to burn. They report to European officers stationed at the nearest colonial post, who report to district commissioners, who report upward through the administrative hierarchy to Boma, the capital, and ultimately to Brussels. When Bolima's rubber delivery falls short of the quota, and it falls short because the quota is designed to be challenging, and because a quota that could be easily met would not maximize extraction, the sentinels arrive. They take hostages, women typically, and sometimes children. The hostages are held at the colonial post until the men of Bolima make up the shortfall. While they are held, they may be put to work. They may be inadequately fed. Some of them may not survive the detention. If the shortfall persists, or if the village is deemed insufficiently cooperative, more severe measures follow. So the shikot, a whip made from dried hippopotamus hide, cut into a corkscrew shape that tears flesh with each stroke, is applied. Village huts are burned. In the most extreme cases, members of the community are killed. And when members of the community are killed by force publique soldiers, the soldiers are required to demonstrate that each bullet fired was used on a human target rather than wasted. The demonstration takes the form of a severed hand. This is not a policy that emerged accidentally through the undirected brutality of individual soldiers in isolated postings. It is a policy that was created, refined, and maintained from the top of the administrative structure. The hand accountability system appears to have developed from an attempt by some officers to prevent their soldiers from wasting ammunition, a real logistical concern in remote postings far from resupply. And the initial idea was that soldiers should account for their use of cartridges. The accounting mechanism chosen was the severed hand, one hand per cartridge used, proof that the bullet had killed. What no one apparently designed, or what no one in authority chose to correct once it emerged, was the obvious perverse incentive this created. Soldiers who needed to account for ammunition, but had not necessarily killed the number of people their cartridge expenditure implied, had an easy solution: cut hands from the living. And soldiers who needed to demonstrate sufficient zeal to their officers had another incentive: cut more hands. Bring baskets of them. Show you are doing your job. E.D. Morel, the journalist and activist who would eventually become the most important figure in the Congo reform movement, who collected testimonies from missionaries across the Congo basin in the early 1900s. These testimonies describe, with a consistency that makes them impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents, the same pattern repeated in location after location. Soldiers arrive with baskets. The baskets contain hands. Officers count the hands against the cartridges used. The records are filed. Missionary John Harris, the husband of Alice Harris, who took the photograph of Ensala, he visited a colonial post and counted 61 severed hands laid out for inspection. He watched an officer count them against a record of ammunition expended. He wrote about this in his reports to missionary societies in Britain. His reports were initially treated as exceptional accounts of aberrant behavior. Eventually, when enough reports from enough missionaries in enough locations described the same practice, the conclusion became unavoidable. This was systematic. Swedish missionary E.V. Sjöblom described arriving at a village to find the inhabitants in a state of terror, hiding in the forest around the cleared land. He found the bodies of 3 men who had been killed by soldiers and had their hands removed. He found a child, still alive, who had had her hand cut off. He described the stench of a pyre where the soldiers had burned the bodies of killed villagers before cutting the hands, because it was easier to remove a hand from a burned body than to carry a whole corpse. Read that sentence again. It was easier to remove a hand from a burned body than to carry a whole corpse. This is the kind of operational efficiency that emerges when a system has been running long enough that its participants have refined their methods. This is not improvised horror. This is practiced horror. This is horror that has been optimized. The economic structure that drives all of this deserves careful attention because Leopold's Congo is not simply violent. It is profitable. That is the point. The violence is not the goal. The goal is rubber, and the rubber is money, and the money flows to Brussels. The violence is the mechanism by which the rubber is obtained, and the mechanism by which the profitability of the operation is maintained. Remove the violence and the quotas cannot be enforced. Remove the quotas and the rubber production collapses. Remove the rubber production and the whole enterprise generates losses rather than returns. The violence is load-bearing. This is what distinguishes the Congo Free State from ordinary colonial brutality. And ordinary colonial brutality was extraordinary enough. The distinction is that in the Congo, the violence was not incidental to the economy. It was the economy. The force publique was not a peacekeeping organization that sometimes used excessive force. It was the primary labor management tool of a private extraction enterprise. Its budget was not a security expense, it was a production cost. Leopold's share of the Congo's resources was structured into the system at every level. He owned the Domaine de la Couronne, a vast area of the most rubber-rich territory set aside as his personal estate, separate from the concession companies and directly administered for his private benefit. Revenue from this area went into his personal accounts and funded his building projects in Belgium, the Royal Museum of Central Africa in Tervuren, the Arc du Cinquantenaire in Brussels, on the thermal baths at Ostend, the Palm House and the Royal Greenhouses at Laeken. Belgian monuments paid for by Congolese rubber, enforced by Congolese suffering. The concession companies were structured to maximize extraction over any given short period without regard for the long-term health of either the rubber supply or the human population. The rubber vines were harvested in ways that killed them, rather than making small cuts that allowed regeneration. The workers were often required to cut down the entire vine to extract maximum latex quickly. Within a decade, large areas of the Congo basin that had been rubber-rich were rubber-depleted. The vines were gone. The quota stayed the same. And the violence that had been used to enforce the quota continued to be used to enforce it, even when the rubber was no longer there to be found. This created situations of pure, structurally generated catastrophes. The villages that had met their quotas for years suddenly found the rubber gone from the surrounding forest. They could not make up the shortfall by foraging further. The adjacent territories were assigned to other villages with their own quotas. They could not purchase rubber to make up the difference. They had no money, and in any case, the state controlled the rubber market. They could do nothing except face the consequences of a quota they had no means to meet. And the force publique had its own internal logic that amplified all of this in directions that even the colonial administration sometimes found inconvenient. The soldiers were not well paid. They were often poorly supplied. They were stationed in remote postings far from their home communities under European officers who ranged from the merely brutal to the genuinely sadistic, with inadequate oversight and enormous practical power over the civilian populations they were supposed to manage. And they could enrich themselves through the same system they were enforcing. Taking rubber, taking food, taking women. Some European officers were more violent than others. There are names in the historical record that stand out even within this context. Léon Fieves, who reportedly ordered his soldiers to collect 100 hands for every patrol and punish them with flogging if they came back short. Charles-Henri Joseph Lemaire, who wrote with evident satisfaction about the effectiveness of terror as a management tool. Roger Casement, the British consul who would later write the report that became one of the key documents of the Congo reform movement, encountered in his travels an officer who kept a tally of killings on a piece of paper in his breast pocket, with what Casement described as a kind of proprietary pride. But it is important not to locate the horror exclusively in individual European officers, however extreme their behavior. The individual officers were operating within a system that rewarded what they did and punished what they did not do. An officer who was lenient, who allowed villagers to miss quotas without severe consequences, who showed mercy, was an officer who was not making his numbers, and an officer who was not making his numbers was an officer whose career in the Congo Free State was not going to advance. The incentive structure was explicit and consistent. Results matter, the methods are your business. The chain of accountability ran upward with a precision that is one of the most disturbing features of the whole operation. Rubber tonnage was reported to district commissioners. District commissioners submitted reports to the Governor-General. The Governor-General submitted reports to Brussels. Brussels, which is to say, Leopold's private secretary, the men who managed his affairs, and Leopold himself, received these reports, processed them, and responded with instructions about how to improve performance. The instructions did not say, "Stop cutting off hands." They said, "Increase production, meet the quotas, generate the returns." There is a document that historians sometimes cite as among the most chilling in the entire archive of the Congo Free State. It is an internal memo from around 1900 in which a district commissioner, responding to pressure from above for increased rubber production, notes that the current enforcement methods are not sufficient and requests authorization for more aggressive measures. The response he receives is not a rebuke for existing methods, it is an authorization to proceed. This is the bureaucracy of atrocity. This is what it looks like when mass violence is administered through the normal channels of a functioning organization. No single document orders the cutting of hands, and no specific instruction says, mutilate civilians to enforce production quotas. What the documents say consistently and repeatedly is, produce results, and the system that produces results in the Congo Free State in the 1890s is the system of the hands and the shikot and the burned villages and the hostage women in the detention posts. The village of Bolima, which we began with, has by 1900 lost somewhere between a third and half of its pre-contact population. Some people have died directly at the hands of the force publique. More have died from hunger, from the diseases that spread through communities whose immune systems are compromised by malnutrition and displacement and grief. More still have fled. gone deeper into the forest, abandoned the village, tried to reach territories beyond the reach of the concession companies. The rubber vines near Balima are depleted. The forest is quieter than it was. There are fewer birds. The colonial post nearest to Bolima is still sending rubber tonnage reports to the district commissioner. The numbers are declining, but they are still positive. The force publique patrols still move through the area. The hands still accumulate in baskets. In Brussels, in the winter of 1900, Leopold II is reviewing plans for a new triumphal arch. The Congo rubber revenues are funding it. The arch will be magnificent. He is particular about the proportions. He has never been to Africa. He will never go. The concession companies deserve more attention than they typically receive in the popular telling of the Congo story, because they are the mechanism through which Leopold was able to amplify his extraction system beyond what his own directly administered territory could support, while simultaneously creating a layer of institutional distance between himself and the worst of what was done. Sank the Abir Congo Company, the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber and Exploration Company, operated one of the most brutal rubber concession regimes in the entire Congo basin. It controlled a territory of roughly 75,000 square kilometers in the Equateur region, an area comparable in size to Ireland. Within this territory, Abir's agents had essentially sovereign power over the population. They set quotas. They employed the force publique. They built their own detention facilities. And they kept their own records of rubber production, punitive expeditions, and casualty figures. Abir's records, portions of which survived the archival burning and have been studied by historians, are among the most detailed documentary evidence of how the extraction system worked at the operational level. They show quota targets and delivery figures. They show records of punitive expeditions dispatched to villages that had failed to meet their quotas. They show records of ammunition expended and in some cases, the accounting of hands that justified that expenditure. They show the salaries of European agents and the cost of the hostage maintenance system. They are the accounts of a business, orderly, legible, organized. And they describe something that was happening to human beings. The European agents of Abir and the other concession companies occupied an interesting psychological and moral position. They were not, for the most part, men who had sought out postings in the Congo because they wanted to torture people. They were young men, often from modest backgrounds, who had come to the Congo because the Congo offered employment and the possibility of advancement and the adventure of Africa, which the popular literature of the era had made glamorous in ways that the reality rapidly corrected. They arrived in a place with no community, no social context, no oversight, enormous practical power over the local population, and a clear and explicit message from the company and from the colonial administration that their job was to produce rubber. The methods were their business. Some of them became brutal very quickly. Some maintained a kind of professional distance that is perhaps as chilling as the brutality, performing the violence as an administrative function without evident emotional investment in it. Some, a small number, protested. A few resigned. At least one European agent, a man named Octave Marron, he appears in the records as someone who tried to resist the most extreme measures and suffered professional consequences for doing so. These cases are the exception. The majority adapted to the system the way human beings adapt to systems when the systems are powerful enough, by redefining normal. If everyone around you is keeping baskets of hands, if the question of what will happen to a village that misses its quota is answered by practice and precedent rather than by individual decision, and if the whole administrative structure within which you operate treats the violence as routine, then the violence becomes routine. The moral threshold for participation drops to zero. You're not making a decision to cut off hands. You're doing your job. This is one of the most important and most disturbing things that the Congo Free State teaches us about the psychology of atrocity. The question is rarely whether human beings can be made to commit mass violence, so the historical record is clear that they can. The more interesting question is how, and the Congo provides a detailed answer. You create a system that defines what is normal, that rewards certain behaviors and punishes others, that provides institutional cover for individual moral capitulation, and that maintains enough distance between the top of the structure and the operational level, that the people at the top can claim ignorance and the people at the operational level can claim obedience. Distance is the key technology. Leopold used it. The concession companies used it. The military officers in the field used it in their relationship to the specific soldiers carrying out specific acts. Every layer of the system was designed so that the layer above it could maintain plausible separation from the layer below. Brussels did not order the cutting of hands. Brussels ordered rubber production. The district commissioner did not order the cutting of hands. He ordered that quotas be met. The force publique officer did not order the cutting of hands. He ordered his soldiers to ensure that ammunition was accounted for. The soldier cut the hand and counted it against his cartridges. At no point in this architecture of managed distance did anyone with authority say, "Go cut hands from living and dead people and bring them to me in baskets." What they said at each level was something that sounded entirely reasonable at that level and that produced, at the bottom of the chain, something entirely unreasonable. This is the bureaucracy of atrocity. This is how it is built. Not with explicit orders to do monstrous things, but with systems that produce monstrous things as the ordinary outcome of people doing their ordinary jobs in the ordinary way. The physical geography of the Congo Basin was itself a factor in how the system operated. The Congo River and its tributaries constitute one of the largest river networks in the world. River travel was the only viable means of moving large quantities of rubber from the forest to the coast. This meant that the extraction system was organized around the rivers, with collection posts at regular intervals along the major waterways and subsidiary systems of paths and carriers moving rubber from the interior to the river banks. The geography also meant that the system was legible from above in a way that land-based systems sometimes are not. The steamers moving up and down the river carried rubber and carried soldiers and carried reports, and the regularity of river transport meant that the administrative chain from Forest Post to Brussels had a consistent rhythm. Leopold invested heavily in river infrastructure, precisely because it was the logistical backbone of the extraction system. The construction of a railway around the Livingston Falls, the series of rapids that prevent ocean-going vessels from accessing the Upper Congo, was one of the Congo Free State's major engineering projects, and it was built at enormous human cost, with thousands of workers dying during construction from disease, exhaustion, and the brutality of the labor conditions. The railway was completed in 1898. It was the artery through which the rubber moved, and it was the thing that made the scale of the extraction possible. By the time E.D. Morel and Roger Casement were building their case against Leopold's system in the early 1900s, the rubber boom was already beginning to decline. Asian rubber plantations, planted in the 1890s when the rubber price first spiked, were coming into production and driving down the price of wild rubber. The Congolese forest vines were depleted. The extraction system was becoming less profitable at the same time that it was becoming more internationally visible. Leopold's response to the declining profitability was to increase the violence of enforcement, to try to extract more from a depleted system by applying more pressure. This was the logic of a system that had no mechanism for adaptation It could only do what it had always done, more intensely. By the mid-1900s, if the people of the rubber districts were being destroyed by a system that was no longer even achieving its original economic purpose. The rubber was gone. The killing continued. E.D. Morel, in one of his pamphlets, described standing on the banks of the Congo River, watching a steamer pass and thinking about the arithmetic. The steamer carried rubber worth many thousands of pounds in the European market. The rubber had been produced by human labor, for which the producers had received nothing, no wages, no trade goods, nothing, except the threat of violence if they did not produce it. The men and women who had harvested that rubber had been denied the basic economic exchange that the civilizing mission narrative claimed to be bringing to Africa. The market, the fair transaction, the mutual benefit of trade. What they had received instead was the force publique, and he found this, the absolute simplicity and nakedness of the exploitation, stripped of even the pretense of commerce, more morally devastating than the violence itself. The violence, at least, acknowledged in its own brutal way that the Congolese people were present, that they existed, that their compliance or resistance mattered. The economic structure underlying the violence denied even that. It treated them as a feature of the landscape, as the mechanism by which rubber was converted from vine to vessel with no more moral standing than the vines themselves. The force publique soldiers, the European agents, the concession company boards in Brussels and London, all of them were part of a system that operated at this level of abstraction from the people it processed. And at the top of the abstraction, in the palace in Brussels, sat the man who had designed it, reading the quarterly returns. The numbers are contested, as all numbers at this scale and distance must be. But the range of serious scholarly estimates tells you something essential by itself. The population of the Congo Basin at the time of European contact in the 1880s was somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. By 1924, when the first Belgian census of any reliability was conducted, the population was approximately 10 million. Somewhere between 10 and 20 million people had disappeared from the demographic record in roughly 4 decades. Not all of these deaths were caused directly by the rubber regime. Sleeping sickness, a parasitic disease that was spreading through Central Africa in the late 19th century, killed enormous numbers. Smallpox, introduced and spread partly by the disruption of communities under the colonial system, killed more. The breakdown of agricultural systems under forced labor conditions caused famine on a scale that is difficult to precisely quantify. The forced displacement of entire communities, the burning of villages, the hostage-taking that disrupted family and social structures. All of this contributed to a demographic catastrophe that compounds in ways that make clean attribution impossible. But here is what we know. The system Leopold designed required forced labor enforced by violence. So that system killed people directly, through the force publique and its soldiers and their bullets and their chicots. It killed people indirectly, through the starvation that follows when a community's ability to feed itself is stripped by labor demands. It killed people through the displacement and the disease that follows displacement. And it killed people through what we might call structural violence, the slow, grinding destruction of communities whose social fabric, agricultural capacity, and physical health were all simultaneously under attack. The scholars who have studied this most carefully, Adam Hochschild, whose 1998 book King Leopold's Ghost brought this history to a broad general audience, Jan van Sina, the Belgian anthropologist who spent decades studying Congolese oral history, Sidney Lenz Hinder, who reported from the region contemporaneously, arrive at figures ranging from 5 million to 15 million excess deaths, with most serious estimates clustering around 8 to 10 million. These are deaths above and beyond what would have occurred in the absence of the rubber regime. These are deaths that the system produced, 8 to 10 million people, in 23 years. To give that scale some context, the Nazi Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jewish people. The Rwandan genocide killed approximately 800,000 people in 100 days. So the Armenian genocide killed somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. Leopold's Congo, which is less well known than any of these, sits at the high end of this grim range, not in terms of proportional annihilation of a specific targeted population, but in absolute numbers of people whose deaths can be traced to a deliberate system of exploitation. The word genocide is contested in the Congo context. The Congolese people were not targeted for extermination on the basis of their ethnicity or identity. They were worked to death and killed as a byproduct of an economic extraction system. This distinction matters to some scholars and is less meaningful to others. What is not contested is the scale of the dying, or the fact that it was produced by a system that a specific man designed and maintained for profit. The international exposure of what was happening in the Congo is itself a fascinating and important story, because it represents one of the earliest examples of what we would now call an international human rights campaign. Coordinated activism across national borders, using media and public pressure and documentary evidence to force a government to change its behavior. The campaign had several key architects. E.D. Morel was a shipping clerk for a British trading company with business in the Congo. In the late 1890s, he noticed something that troubled him. Ships going from Belgium to the Congo were loaded with guns and ammunition. Ships coming back from the Congo were loaded with rubber and ivory. The ships contained almost no trade goods. There was nothing in what came back from the Congo that represented payment for the rubber. The rubber was not being purchased. It was being taken. And in a flash of commercial insight that would have enormous moral consequences, Morel understood what this meant. The Congolese people were not trading. They were laboring under coercion, and he began to investigate. Morel was not a dramatic person. He was a careful, methodical, enormously tenacious journalist and activist who understood that the most powerful arguments are built on evidence, not emotion. He gathered testimony. He cultivated contacts among missionaries in the Congo. And he published a series of articles that systematically documented the rubber system and the violence that enforced it. He founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904 with the specific goal of building the kind of international pressure that could force Belgium to act. Roger Casement was the British consul to the Congo who wrote, in 1904, a report to the British Foreign Office that described what he had seen in travels through the rubber districts. The Casement report, as it became known, it was a methodical, restrained, devastating document. It named places, named dates, cited testimony from specific individuals. It described mutilations, described hostage systems, described the Chicotte, described the demographic collapse of villages in the rubber zones. It was the kind of report that could not be dismissed as missionary exaggeration or anti-Belgian propaganda because it came from a professional diplomat of the British government, a man with no obvious ideological axe to grind. If the British government published the Casement report, Leopold's response was to hire a commission of inquiry of his own, which he clearly expected to exonerate the system. The commission, to his evident surprise, did not exonerate the system. It confirmed it. It found evidence of mutilation, of forced labor, of killings, of the hostage system. Leopold suppressed the full report for a year and eventually released a modified version. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Public pressure built through the years from roughly 1900 to 1908 in a way that makes the Congo reform movement one of the more remarkable examples of 19th century political mobilization. The Alice Harris photographs were shown at lantern-slide lectures across Britain and the United States. Lectures that could draw hundreds of people to a church hall on a weeknight. People who came to hear missionaries describe what they had witnessed and then looked at photographs projected on a screen and went home profoundly disturbed. Mark Twain wrote a savage satirical pamphlet called King Leopold's Soliloquy. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a pamphlet called The Crime of the Congo. Novelists, journalists, politicians, clergymen, a broad coalition of voices that Leopold had enough money to temporarily muddy, but not enough to permanently silence. Leopold spent enormous sums on a public relations campaign. He funded newspapers, he cultivated politicians, he created front organizations designed to appear to be independent monitors of his administration. He commissioned reports that contradicted the missionary testimonies. He attacked his critics personally, accused them of bad faith. One suggested that the whole campaign was driven by British commercial rivalry with Belgium. He was not stupid about this. Some of his PR moves were genuinely effective, at least temporarily, but the evidence was too consistent, too broadly sourced, too visually dramatic to be permanently managed away. In 1908, under intense international and domestic pressure, Leopold II transferred the Congo Free State to Belgium. He did not do this voluntarily or graciously. So he negotiated a settlement in which Belgium agreed to cover his debts in the Congo and to pay him a substantial personal grant as compensation for the loss of his property. He described the transfer in terms that suggested he was making a gift to his country rather than surrendering to political pressure. He remained until his death unwilling to acknowledge that the system he had built was what the evidence showed it to be. He died in December 1909. 14 months after the transfer, so he was 74 years old. His last significant act before his death was to order the burning of the Congo Free State's archives. The archives burned for 8 days. Read that slowly. The man who owned the Congo for 23 years, who had received rubber tonnage reports and administrative correspondence and military records and financial statements that documented in extraordinary detail the functioning of his extraction system. As he was dying, he had those records destroyed, and what survived is what survived by accident, or was copied by critics before the burning, or was too widely distributed to be recalled and eliminated. What burned was whatever Leopold was most anxious about the world seeing. We do not know exactly what burned. We know that what remains is already damning enough. The Belgian Congo, the territory after 1908, under Belgian state administration rather than Leopold's private rule, was not a free or just place. Belgium implemented reforms, abolished the worst features of the rubber terror, ended the formal hand-cutting system, abolished the most exploitative concession arrangements. But the fundamental structure of a colonial economy that extracted resources for European benefit through the labor of people who had no meaningful say in their own governance persisted until Congolese independence in 1960. The infrastructure Leopold built, the railways, the river steamers, the administrative posts, was built to serve extraction. It served extraction for 50 years after his death. The Congo that became the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1960 inherited this infrastructure and the colonial institutions built on it. What it didn't inherit was any real experience of self-governance at the scale of a nation-state, any real preparation for the administrative and economic challenges of independence. any cushion of institutional development that might have allowed the transition to be managed. And Belgium's departure from the Congo in 1960 was, in many respects, as cynical and self-serving as Leopold's original claim to it. The Belgians left quickly, under political pressure, taking most of their skilled administrators with them and leaving behind a country whose own educated population had been systematically excluded from positions of real authority for 80 years. The catastrophic political history of the Democratic Republic of Congo since 1960, the coup against Patrice Lumumba, the decades of Mobutu's kleptocracy, the civil wars that killed millions more people in the 1990s and 2000s, the ongoing conflict in the east of the country, is not solely attributable to Leopold. To say so would be to reproduce the colonial logic of attributing African suffering primarily to European actors rather than to the complex interplay of local politics, regional dynamics, and the global systems that continue to extract the Congo's resources with a consistency that Leopold would have recognized and perhaps admired. But the structure of extraction, the orientation of the economy toward the export of raw materials at the expense of internal development, the institutional weakness of governance structures that were never designed to serve the Congolese population, these are legacies with specific genealogies. They were not inevitable. They were built. And when Leopold II, sitting in his palace in Brussels, built much of the foundation. In Belgium itself, the memory of Leopold is complicated in a way that tells you something important about how societies manage the history they find most uncomfortable. For most of the 20th century, Leopold was remembered primarily as a builder, a king who funded monuments, who gave Belgium its single colony, who built the Royal Museum of Central Africa at Tervuren with its extraordinary collection of Congolese art and natural history specimens and ethnographic objects. The museum, which was itself built with Congo rubber money, framed the Congo story for generations of Belgian schoolchildren as a story of exploration and civilization rather than extraction and terror. Leopold's statues stood in Belgian cities, his equestrian portraits hung in municipal buildings. He was, and in the dominant national narrative, a complicated but ultimately significant king. Adam Hochschild's book in 1998 and the broader international discussion of colonial crimes that accelerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries began to shift this. The Royal Museum of Central Africa underwent a significant renovation and reopened in 2018 with a substantially different interpretive framework, the one that foregrounded the violence of the extraction system rather than the achievements of exploration. Statues of Leopold in Belgian cities became flashpoints in debates about colonial memory, particularly after the 2020 protests that spread globally in the wake of George Floyd's death and brought renewed attention to the public commemoration of figures associated with racial violence. Several Leopold statues were vandalized. Some were removed. And Leopold II is still remembered differently in Belgium than he is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Belgium, the conversation about his legacy is a conversation about how to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The genuine infrastructure development, the genuine horror of the extraction system, the question of how to reckon with a past that is both recent and unresolved. In the DRC, there is less ambiguity. He is the man who took the country, killed its people, and burned the evidence. Both versions are part of the same truth. And somewhere in the archive of colonial photography, the photograph of Insala still exists. A man on a veranda. What is left of his daughter on the floor in front of him? He's looking at it. He has nowhere else to look. The system that produced that moment was designed in an office 3,000 miles away by a man who never visited, never looked, and in his final days burned the papers. But he could not burn the photographs. And he could not burn Alice Harris's lantern slides, or Roger Casement's dispatches, or E.D. Morel's newspaper articles, or the testimonies of hundreds of missionaries and survivors gathered over decades and preserved in archives in Britain and Belgium and the United States. He could not burn Nsala's face. This is the last thing worth knowing about Leopold II's legacy, and perhaps the most important. He understood at some level that the record was dangerous. That is why he burned it. And what he did not understand, what the history of all such attempts at erasure suggests the architects of atrocity consistently fail to understand, is that the record is always incomplete, but never entirely gone. That the people who survive carry the memory of what was done to them, that the photographs outlast the palaces, that the faces in the photographs outlast the man who caused them to look the way they look. Leopold II died in 1909 in a palace he had built with rubber money. He was given a state funeral. The crowds who lined the streets to watch the cortege pass were not, by contemporary accounts, particularly numerous or particularly grieving. One account describes a scattering of boos from the crowd. He was buried in the royal crypt at Laeken. His coffin was decorated with flowers from the royal greenhouses. The greenhouses had been built with Congo rubber money. The irony was lost on no one who knew how to read it. As whether Belgium has fully learned to read it is a question that the Belgians are still slowly working out. Whether the rest of the world has learned the lesson that Leopold's Congo most clearly teaches, that the machinery of civilization can be turned with sufficient determination and sufficient distance into the machinery of mass death, and that the men who operate it can remain in their own minds and for a surprisingly long time in the minds of others. Oh, gentlemen, that is a question with a less comfortable answer. The system runs when we look away. The board goes up on the wall. The numbers are entered in the ledger, and somewhere, in a forest 3,000 miles from the palace, a man comes home to find what has been left for him on the veranda. The question of how we remember atrocities, which ones enter the historical consciousness, which ones remain obscure, which ones generate sustained political consequences, is itself a political question, and the story of how Leopold's Congo moved from obscurity to relative visibility is instructive in ways that go beyond the specific history. For most of the 20th century, the Congo Free State was known primarily to specialists. It was covered in histories of Belgian colonialism and in histories of Africa. But it had not achieved the kind of general public recognition that would make it a reference point in broader conversations about imperial violence or genocide. Part of this is simple. The Congo did not directly involve the major powers of the Second World War, whose atrocities have been most exhaustively documented and most consistently taught. Part of it is the geography. Central Africa was for most European and American audiences, and a place of remoteness and abstraction rather than a place they had any concrete sense of. Part of it is the specific nature of the archival record. Leopold had burned the most compromising documents, and the surviving record, while damning, required expertise to navigate. Adam Hochschild's 1998 book King Leopold's Ghost changed this significantly. Hochschild was not an academic historian. He was a journalist with a talent for narrative. And he wrote about the Congo the way a skilled journalist writes about a crime, following specific people, building scenes, staying close to the human experience of what happened. The book was a bestseller in several countries. It introduced the Congo Free State to general readers who had never heard of it. It created, for the first time in the English-speaking world, a broad public awareness of Leopold's system and its consequences. The reaction was interesting and somewhat revealing. and in Belgium, the book was initially received with a mixture of defensiveness and denial that gradually shifted, over the following decade, towards something more like genuine reckoning. Belgian historians produced responses, some critical of Hochschild's methodology, some genuinely engaged with revising the national narrative. The Royal Museum of Central Africa at Tervuren, which had been the primary institutional site for Belgian public memory of the Congo, began a long process of reconsidering its interpretive framework. The renovation and reopening of the museum in 2018 represented a genuine, if incomplete, acknowledgement of what Leopold's system had been. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the response to international attention to Leopold's crimes was more complicated. For Congolese people, the crimes were not a discovery. They were part of a historical memory that had never been lost, even when it was not given international visibility. And the oral histories of communities in the former rubber districts had preserved the memory of the force publique and the hand-cutting system across generations. When the international attention arrived, it did not feel to many Congolese people like an illumination of forgotten history. It felt like a belated acknowledgement of something that had always been known. And this asymmetry between the communities whose history it is and the international audiences for whom it is a revelation is itself one of the legacies of the colonial structure. The tools of historical documentation and international communication were, in the colonial period and for much of the post-colonial period, concentrated in European hands. The story of the Congo was told by missionaries and journalists and diplomats, filtered through their categories, shaped by their audiences, to preserved in their archives. The Congolese people's own telling of their history existed primarily in forms, oral tradition, community memory, that the international historical apparatus was not designed to recognize or preserve with the same systematic care. This is not simply a Belgian problem or a Congo problem, since it is the general condition of colonial historiography. The colonized appear in the historical record primarily as subjects of the colonizers' documentation rather than as autonomous producers of their own historical narrative. The Congo reform movement was possible in part because it was led by Europeans, Morel and Casement and Conan Doyle and Mark Twain, whose voice is carried in the European public sphere. The Congolese voices that appear in the reform literature appear as testimonies filtered through the translation and selection of missionary observers. This does not make the testimony false. It makes it incomplete in specific ways that we should acknowledge. The ongoing extraction of the Democratic Republic of Congo's resources by international corporations, often under conditions that reproduce, in modified and updated forms, the basic logic of the Leopold system. Mineral wealth flowing out, see inadequate returns flowing back, a population living in poverty in one of the richest territories on Earth. This is not a direct continuation of the rubber regime. It is not the force publique, but it sits in a relationship to the rubber regime that is not coincidental. The structures of extraction, the legal frameworks that grant international companies access to Congolese resources on terms that do not primarily benefit Congolese people, to the weakness of state institutions that were never designed to serve the population they govern. All of this has a genealogy that leads back, in part, to the decisions Leopold made in the 1890s. This is what structural legacy means. Not that Leopold caused the Congo Wars of the late 1990s or the current conflict in the East, not that he is responsible for the specific decisions made by specific people over the following century, but that the structures he built, the extraction economy, have the institutional orientation toward foreign benefit rather than domestic development, the normalization of coercion as a labor management tool, These structures had consequences that outlasted him and his immediate system, and that continued to shape the conditions within which Congolese people live and work and die. The statues of Leopold II in Belgium are, in this light, more than simply questions about commemorating a bad person. They are questions about what a society chooses to put at the center of its own story. A statue of Leopold in a Belgian city square is not simply a historical artifact. It is a claim about his relative importance, his enduring relevance, his right to occupy the public visual field. And the answer to the question of whether he deserves to occupy that field is complicated by the fact that the society, considering the question, is the one that benefited from what he built, and that its infrastructure and its cultural institutions and its relative prosperity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were, in part, built with Congo rubber money. Belgium is not alone in this. Britain's museums contain the spoils of empire. France's institutions were built partly on colonial extraction. The United States benefited economically from the broader structure of global imperialism, even where it was not directly administering colonies. So the question of how to reckon with this kind of diffuse structural benefit, spread across generations, absorbed into the fabric of societies that did not individually choose it, is one that no society has yet fully answered. Leopold is a useful focus for these questions precisely because his case is so extreme, so well documented, so hard to explain away as the unintended consequence of well-meaning policies gone wrong. He was not well-meaning, he knew what he was doing, and the distance he maintained from the Congo was not ignorance, it was strategy. The burning of the archives was not confusion, it was the act of a man who understood very clearly what the records contained and what they proved. And yet the photographs survived, and Nsala's face survived. And the testimony of the missionaries, and the report of Casement, and the journalism of Morel, and the oral histories of the communities in the rubber districts, all of this survived and is available. It constitutes a record that does not resolve into any comfortable narrative about the inevitable costs of progress or the complexity of good intentions. The man in the photograph on the veranda is looking at what a system produced. The system was designed by a man who was very good at not looking. The world's eventual confrontation with what that system produced was forced by people who refused to let the looking stop. That confrontation is still incomplete. The looking continues.